Is the author of the book of Daniel a real prophet who correctly predicts the future? Or is he a false prophet who fails in his attempts to predict the future? Many scholars have suggested at the end of Daniel 11, the author attempts to predict the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and he fails to predict it correctly. Christians have responded to this allegation by saying he is not trying to predict the death of Antiochus at all, but rather he's trying to predict the death of the Antichrist at some point in the future. This is one of the most hotly debated subjects in the book of Daniel, and the author's prophetic integrity is on the line. So in this video, we're going to try to determine who is right. We're going to look closely at the data and see if the evidence suggests that the author is trying to predict the death of Antiochus and fails, or has he in fact shifted in his prophetic perspective and he is talking about the death of the Antichrist. This is what we want to look at, and we want to look at it in some detail. Now, it's not absolutely necessary that you've seen my last video, which covered the first 27 verses of this chapter, which chronicled the wars of the Ptolemies down in Egypt with their Seleucid neighbors to the northeast, but it would be helpful. Nevertheless, we're going to pick it up in verse 28, where Antiochus has been down conquering in Egypt. Now, it's important to understand that everybody is in agreement that we are talking about Antiochus Epiphanes in verse 28. The question is whether or not in the next several verses the writer switches from talking about Antiochus to talking about the Antichrist, or if he just continues to talk about Antiochus. We'll treat that when we get there. But in verse 28, it says, "He shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land." Now, this is referring to Antiochus leaving Egypt with extraordinary wealth, which he displayed and lavished as he usually did. He was well known for being financially irresponsible. Now, the Greek historian said that even though people were impressed by the parties he threw afterwards, he was still known to be a man of contemptible conduct, and in fact, as he put it, quote, "They could scarcely believe that so much excellence and baseness could exist in one and the same breast," unquote. And so that's the commentary we get from Polybius on Antiochus's wealth after he leaves Egypt. Now, the rest of this verse is concerned with the sack of Jerusalem in the year 169. This is recorded for us in 1 Maccabees, which says, "And after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again in the 143rd year, and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude, and entered proudly into the sanctuary, and took away the golden altar, and the candlestick of light, and all the vessels thereof, and the table of the showbread, and the pouring vessels, and the vessels, and the censers of gold, and the veil, and the crown, and the golden ornaments that were before the temple, all which he pulled off. He took also the silver and the gold, and the precious vessels. Also he took the hidden treasures which he found. And when he had taken all away, he went into his own land, having made a great massacre and spoken very proudly." Now, you don't want to confuse this event with what is sometimes referred to as the abomination of desolation, where Seleucid forces went into the temple, built an altar to a false god, and slaughtered swine in Yahweh's temple. That is a separate event, which will be referred to by Daniel in the next few verses. As it turns out, Antiochus ravished Jerusalem twice. This is the first ravishing, where he simply plunders the temple of wealth and commits a great massacre. But the actual enforcement of the worship of false gods, that is a second event that is going to be mentioned in a moment. Verse 29, "At the time appointed he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. The previous time, Ptolemy the sixth was in Memphis, and Ptolemy the seventh was in Alexandria, and they were not united against Antiochus. But this time they are united. They are co-regents against Antiochus, and thus the authors note that it shall not be this time as it was before." Verse 30, "For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged, and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant." The Kittim here is a reference to Rome. Rome had been concerned about the balance of power in the Mediterranean world because they didn't want any rivals, especially at a time when they were engaged in their own war with Macedon. And so the advance of Antiochus Epiphanes was a concern to them. So they send their consul, Popilius Linus, to come and to tell Antiochus he needs to turn around. In fact, Polybius says that he drew a circle around Antiochus in the sand, and he says, you need to decide before you leave this circle what you're going to do. And of course, Antiochus, though shamed, obeyed, and he withdrew from Egypt and stops at Jerusalem on his way back. Verse 31, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. When Antiochus is invading Egypt, a rumor gets back to the land of Israel that he has died there in the invasion. And Jason, who you remember from my video on Daniel chapter 9, he used to be high priest, but he was ousted when Menelaus came along and said, look, Antiochus, give me the high priesthood of Jason, and I will give you more money. And so Antiochus is giving away the high priesthood in Jerusalem to the highest bidder, and Jason got displaced. Well, now he launches a coup against the new high priest, against Menelaus, and begins to kill many of his supporters. Jason initially enjoys the support of many citizens in Jerusalem, but alas, his violence against Jerusalem turns the people against him. Antiochus regards the whole nation as in revolt due to the turbulences in Jerusalem over the high priesthood. He proceeds to try to stamp out Judaism by building the Acra. The Acra is a fortress that is placed at the Temple Mount to try to keep an eye on the people. He desolates the temple by having an altar built to Bel-Shemayim, who is the Syrian god, the counterpart to the Greek Zeus Olympius. And he has a pig, which is unclean according to Jewish law, sacrificed there in Yahweh's temple. He destroys any copies of Scripture he can find, and he forbids circumcision in the festivals with the threat of death. And so there had never been a religious persecution like this before. He tried to completely eliminate Yahwism from the world. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. First Maccabees. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many even from Israel gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white, until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. Who are the wise who will not go along with the program of Antiochus Epiphanes here? It could be those seeking righteousness and justice in 1 Maccabees chapter 2. This group took its families and possessions and went into the wilderness to try to get away from their persecutors and live there according to the Torah. But when Antiochus' agents found them, they attacked the group on the Sabbath day, and so they weren't going to put up any resistance because they didn't want to violate the Sabbath. And so this group has something in common with the book of Daniel as a whole in its attempt to use the wisdom of God to survive and outlive its persecutors. However, their attempt to avoid persecution by going out into the wilderness seems inconsistent with the picture here of those who are instructing many, even at the cost of their own martyrdom. And so some have suggested that the wise represent a nonviolent but uncompromising teaching group. Again, a group that wants to use the teachings of God to resist Antiochus, but not the sword. And you wouldn't expect that these folks would all leave town. Many of them might have stayed in Jerusalem or in other major hubs and just faced their deaths instead of leaving. Others suggest that the wise here are violent resistors, the Maccabees, in the revolt that would ultimately be successful in driving out Antiochus Epiphanes. So we're not exactly sure who the wise are. There are many options on the table. Daniel doesn't exactly give us a lot to work with here, so we have to speculate. And then the wise receive a little help. Who does the little help refer to? Well, if the wise are a nonviolent teaching group, the little help they receive may be the Maccabees themselves who come along, and perhaps for whatever reason, the wise are not very impressed with the Maccabees. Maybe because the Maccabees initially lost some important leadership in fighting with Antiochus, and it may not have seemed that they were going to be very successful at the first. Or it could honestly be any insincere group that walked away from the cause. In this type of resistance against Antiochus, there would be a lot of people who would say, yeah, we're here, we're going to help, and then ultimately walked away. The truth is, we just don't know exactly who these groups refer to. Now, in this section of text is where it gets interesting. Now, keep in mind that most scholars think the rest of this chapter is all about Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, this is the point where I think it is very possible that there is a shift in perspective, and we are no longer talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. We are now talking about the Antichrist. We will explore this at length, but I want to read this section. Just keep this in your mind. Now we want to raise the question, are we still just talking about Antiochus? Are we talking about the Antichrist? When in this section do we make the shift? Verse 36, and the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. A God whom his father did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strangest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. At the time of the end the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall come into countries, and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand. Edom and Moab, in the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. According to most scholars, both those who are Christian and those who are not, this section of Daniel is written during the period of the Maccabean revolt. So, in the year 164 BC, the Jews will succeed in driving Antiochus from their land, and this text is written sometime before that, maybe in 166 or 165 BC. And so, according to most scholars, what the author is going to do in the next 3 verses, he's just going to look at Antiochus Epiphanes as he sees him and write down his profile. So we have to ask ourselves, do these 3 verses is this an accurate description of Antiochus Epiphanes? Would it make sense for anyone in the ancient world to say these things about Antiochus Epiphanes? If it does not make sense, then we have more credibility for the notion that it might be about the Antichrist. So let's look at this section. Verse 36, and the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. Now, I'll just say, first of all, there is no evidence that he ever dishonored any gods. We'll develop this more in the next verse. But for those who think that this is, in fact, about Antiochus Epiphanes, what do they think verse 36 refers to? Well, some of his coins use the title Antiochus the King, God Manifest. Earlier coins were not so arrogant. This practice starts in about 269 BC. So if you're a Jewish person looking at a coin, and you can see the coin here on the screen, which says that Antiochus is God manifest, you would certainly see this as very blasphemous. Some have also made reference to a wordplay that is used to make fun of Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means God manifest, and he would eventually be called Epimanes, madman. Verse 37, he shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. Now this just plainly does not fit Antiochus Epiphanes. Look at what Polybius says. In sacrifices he furnished to cities, and in the honors he paid to the gods, he far surpassed all his predecessors. So it's not only not the case that he didn't pay attention to the gods, he paid them more attention than his predecessors. Verse 37 just simply does not fit Antiochus Epiphanes. But it's very interesting. Most scholars, including good scholars like Goldingay, are still going to try. They're still going to try to line this up with Antiochus Epiphanes even when the data doesn't fit. Look at what Goldingay says. There may be an allusion to his title Epiphanes, God manifest, to his use on coins of the title Theos, or God, and of divine symbols, and to his plundering of temples and suppressing of other religions. Then look at what he says. None of this was peculiar to Antiochus. So other rulers had used the title Theos. Other rulers had plundered temples, such as his father Antiochus III, when he plundered temples to try to pay off the Romans. Many rulers had done these things. So how would it make any sense for this author in verse 37 to say that the Antiochus is especially blasphemous or especially apathetic toward the gods? This just is not the case. Hence the logic of many that this may actually be about the Antichrist. Now, many are going to try to salvage the idea that this is about Antiochus Epiphanes by suggesting that the author of Daniel is exaggerating Antiochus's program of promoting the god Zeus instead of Apollo. And so when the author says that he didn't honor the god of his fathers, it's talking about Apollo because Antiochus chose to promote Zeus instead. And you can find this in many commentaries. Now, Newsom, who I would consider to be very secular, she doesn't think that Daniel has the ability to predict the future. She shows that this theory does not work and that it does not explain the text. So we're going to quote her. The general gist of the accusation is that Antiochus abandoned the worship of other gods, including the ancestral god of the Seleucid dynasty, Apollo. This is simply not the case. In 166, Antiochus staged a spectacular festival and procession at the sanctuary of Apollo at Daphne, near Antioch. A special coin was issued honoring Apollo, and the procession featured the statues of many deities. It is the case, however, that the mint at Antioch, as early as 173 or 172, had replaced the figure of Apollo on the reverse of Antiochus's coins with the figure of a seated Zeus Olympius, though other mints retained the traditional image. So in other words, it's not the case that he took Apollo off of every coin and replaced him with Zeus. This is just one coin. He still has other coins that retain Apollo. And perhaps this was sufficient for the author of Daniel to have derived the impression that Antiochus's veneration of Zeus Olympius amounted to a rejection of Apollo, since within Judaism, one could not honor a second god without betraying one's ancestral deity. So notice what Newsom is going to try to do here to make this work. In Judaism, if you honor any other god but Yahweh, then you have not been faithful to Yahweh. And so she's suggesting the author of Daniel is superimposing Judaism's logic onto polytheism, as though a pagan could only truly honor one God. You can only honor Apollo, and if you go to honor Zeus at all, then you've dishonored Apollo. Now, this is very nonsensical. This seems to suggest that Jews assumed the logic of their religion was the same in every other religion. But if you read the Bible, you know this is not the case. A Jew knows that a pagan can worship many gods. And sometimes they might honor Zeus, sometimes they might honor Apollo, sometimes they might honor some other deity. And that to honor Zeus a little more was not necessarily to all out reject Apollo. But Newsom suggests that the author of Daniel doesn't know this, that he just assumes that polytheists should have kind of a sense of monotheistic devotion to just one God. And I don't buy that at all. This is a demonstration of how desperate many scholars, it seem to be, are in their attempts to make this all about Antiochus Epiphanes, because they don't want to accept that Daniel might be actually predicting someone yet to come. Now, this has been an enigmatic phrase, that he will not regard the one beloved by women. And a number of folks have suggested this might be a reference to the god Tammuz, which is mentioned in the book of Ezekiel. He said also to me, "You will see still greater abominations that they commit." Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Now, what is that a reference to? Well, Tammuz spent one half of the year down in the underworld, because when his woman, Iana, who would later be known as the goddess Ishtar, when she died and went into the underworld, he did not mourn for her. And so she allowed demons to drag him down and replace him in the underworld. Well, she ultimately rejected this, and she said, this is what we're going to do. One half of the year, he's going to be up here with me, and his sister is going to take his place in the underworld. And then for the other half of the year, he's going to go down into the underworld, and he and his sister can just trade out. And this is how you get the seasons, according to the myth of Tammuz. Now, the problem with this is the god Tammuz was not worshipped by Seleucid kings like Antiochus anyway. This is not one of the gods of his fathers that he could have disregarded, because his fathers did not worship this god. So this is not an explanation for us. What about Adonis? Adonis was a very handsome man. His mother was turned into a tree, and then the tree gave birth to him. And then, when he grew up and became very handsome, two goddesses began to feud over him. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and Persephone, the goddess of the underworld. Well, eventually the feud gets bad enough that Zeus has to intervene. And he says that Adonis will spend 1/3 of the year with Persephone, 1/3 of the year with Aphrodite, and then 1/3 of the year with whoever he wants to spend it with. And of course, for that extra third of the year, he spends it with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, rather than Persephone, the goddess of the underworld. Now, there's no particular evidence that Antiochus dishonored Adonis. So again, this is a shot in the dark. It's just speculation. It's just folks trying to find something to make it work. What about the notion that the person being referred to is a homosexual? In the old King James Version, it says that he will not regard the desire of women. So if a woman desires him or desires a man, well, he doesn't care about that, or he doesn't personally himself have any desire for women. Is that going on here? Well, the word kimda that is being used here is usually used adjectively. In other words, it's describing someone. He's not honoring someone who is desired. He's not dismissing desire itself, which is the way you would have to make that work. You'd have to take it as a noun instead of an adjective to make that work. And besides that, it wouldn't make much sense, because in context, he has been describing, and he will continue to describe gods that are not honored by this king. Well, why would it make sense in the middle of that conversation to just stop and be like, oh yeah, he's gay? I mean, why would he do that? Nothing anywhere else in Daniel has been said about gay people. And I think that people who lean toward this interpretation, scholars do not lean toward this interpretation because it makes no sense. But people who lean toward this interpretation probably just have a few extra axes to grind against gay people. And I'm certainly not going to defend homosexuality, but to think that it's showing up in this passage is kind of comical. Verse 38, he shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. A God whom his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. Now, when we find this phrase, God of fortresses, we try to find kind of a stock epithet for a known deity, but we can't find one. There's no God in the ancient Seleucid context who is known as a God of fortresses. 39. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many and shall divide the land for a price. While it is the case that Antiochus, like other kings, honored Jews who were willing to Hellenize, there is no specific evidence that he ever had a program where he honored a specific foreign deity or honored anybody who honored this deity along with him, a god whom his fathers did not know. This just does not fit Antiochus. Verse 40 is interesting. So scholars will say that these last 39 verses, we know who they apply to. We know all the Seleucid kings that are talked about as king of the north. And then we've been talking about Antiochus Epiphanes for the last several verses. And then in the last three verses, 37 through 39, they'll say those three verses fit Antiochus Epiphanes, even though, as we've seen, they don't. And then they'll say, verse 40, we catch up with the time of the author. In other words, the first 39 verses of this chapter, the author, these are all in the past for him. He has not been predicting the future. He's just been writing down things that have already happened. Then you get to verse 40, and he suddenly begins to try to predict the future, and he will not succeed in doing so. He's been recording history, and now it's time for real prophecy. He's going to actually try to predict something for the next 6 verses. And they'll say that this is where he begins to fail, because he's going to try to predict something, and people cannot predict the future. And so let's unpack this a little bit and see if this is convincing. Verse 40. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall come into countries, and shall overflow and pass through. So suddenly, Antiochus, who has been firmly rebuked in previous verses, the Romans put him in check. The author said this emphatically back in verses 29 and 30. Now suddenly, he's thrown off the chains. He's now able to conquer Egypt and beyond. No mention of the Romans. No mention of anything that might hold him in check. He just conquers. Verse 41. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab in the main part of the Ammonites. Now, most think that the author formed these predictions at the end of the chapter by simply drawing on patterns in earlier material in this chapter, and also including some, eschatological motifs that he finds in the prophets. Now, the problem here is these countries that are mentioned, Moab, Edom, Ammonites, they have not been mentioned earlier in the chapter. So if the author is just like, hey, I'm going to sit down and try to guess the future and maybe it'll come right, why would he suddenly mention countries that have not been part of the rhythm, rhyme, and pattern of history as he has recorded it to this juncture? And these countries are not major countries in the apocalyptic passages of other prophets. If he's just drawing on these other prophets and these other apocalypses, why would he suddenly include these countries? It makes no sense. Also, it would be counterintuitive for a Jew if he is making all this up to predict the salvation of his enemies, right after predicting thousands of his own countrymen being killed. This prophecy would not be desirable, nor would it be likely to come true on the merits of chance. So, if I'm going to try to write something down, if I'm going to try to predict the future and I'm going to say something that hopefully will turn out to be true, I'm not going to say, oh yeah, by the way, Mexico is going to conquer Canada in the next 2 or 3 years, because that's not likely to come true. You want to say something that's likely to come true. And to suddenly have all these specific things that are unlikely to come true, why would he write that down if he's just guessing, trying to guess the future? And why would he say thousands of my countrymen are going to die and oh yeah, our traditional enemies are going to live? I mean, that's kind of strange. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. Now look at Newsom try to explain this. She says, the mention of Libya and Ethiopia is also curious, since the author generally avoids actual geographical designations. Because Libya and Ethiopia were the only two nations that shared borders with Egypt, the author may be adapting the notion of the gathering of the nations for the final battle, especially the nations that follow Gog and Ezekiel. So, not only is Antiochus suddenly able to conquer Egypt, not only is there no mention of the Romans, who have been mentioned twice in this chapter, of preventing conquest of Egypt. The author just suddenly leaves them off in his attempts to guess the future, according to Newsom. But he's going to go beyond and conquer these other territories that are beyond Egypt. Again, if you're going to just sit down and try to guess the future, you should not say that Mexico is going to conquer Canada. It would seem, if he's a quack, if he's just trying to guess, he would say something that is more likely to come statistically true. And so I think that scholars like Newsom, who think he's just trying to guess Antiochus's future, that they're deluding themselves, because no one who lives at the time of the Maccabean revolt, who sees how encumbered Antiochus is with fighting his enemies and how he's beginning to fail more and more, how he's been put in check by the Romans, no one is going to say, oh yeah, by the way, he's just going to go conquer the continent of Africa. It would be counterintuitive. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. So the idea is he's in Seleucid territory. He's the king of Seleucia. He comes through the promised land. He continues on into Egypt and is able to go further beyond. For some reason, the Romans don't stop him. But he gets bad news from back in the east, and so he's on his way back, and he's going through the promised land. He's setting up camp somewhere in between the sea, the Mediterranean, and Mount Zion, Jerusalem, somewhere in here. And this is where he meets his end. This is where he died. Again, the Romans didn't stop him. The Egyptians didn't stop him going this way. The Maccabees that he was fighting with apparently have not been able to stop him. But now on his way back, he's going to die in the promised land. So how did Antiochus die? This is where people will discredit Daniel. Back when we were in Daniel chapter 9, I said, look at this. Not only does Daniel have the right timing for the death of Antiochus and for the purification of the temple, he correctly predicted that they would happen at the same time. And yet they did. They both happened in December of 164. And yet scholars will not give Daniel much credit for those predictions. And the reason why is they flip over here to Daniel 11 and they go, but when he actually tries to predict the death of Antiochus, he gets it wrong. So how did Antiochus die? Well, it depends on who you ask. There are some general agreements, but what is agreed is he did not die in the promised land. Polybius reports that after the abortive attempt to plunder the temple, he went mad as a result of divine displeasure and died at Thebais in Persia. 2 Maccabees indicates that Antiochus died in the very act of robbing the temple. However, a different portion in 2 Maccabees has him driven back from an attempt to rob temples in Persepolis, and subsequently receiving word that his forces in Judea were defeated by Judas the Maccabees. Then the God of Israel sends a deadly disease upon Antiochus, who attempts to repent, giving up his claim to be equal with God, and to convert to Judaism, only to be rebuffed by God. And in 1 Maccabees, Antiochus turned back from the temple in Elymas, and hearing news of the reverses in Judea, falls into depression and realizes that his impending death is due to his desecration of the temple in Jerusalem. So these authors might want to connect his activities in Jerusalem to his death, but there's agreement here that he dies in the eastern part of the empire. And historians usually believe that that's where he dies, over in the territories of Persia. So I want to again quote Newsom because she's representative of the field. She's kind of representative of the consensus. If you read other scholars, other major commentators like Collins or Goldingay, she accurately portrays the field. Now, the assumption that many of these scholars have is that the author cannot possibly predict the future, and therefore any of the prophecies in Daniel that are correct were actually written after the fact. They've already happened. He's just writing history. He's just writing it down as though it's a prediction. And then when you get to the place where the predictions in Daniel start to fail, these are actual predictions. So in other words, if he gets it right, it's because it's already in the past. If he gets it wrong, it's sometime in the future. And he's actually trying to predict the future and fails. That is the bias with which many scholars approach this book. As Newsom says, since the author of Daniel 11 does not seem to know about Antiochus's actual campaign in the east in late 165, right? So in this passage, this king is on his way back to the east and never makes it. Well, in history, Antiochus does actually go into the east for a campaign in the latter part of his life. The rededication of the temple by Judah the Maccabee in December of 164, or the death of Antiochus in Elam at about that same time, since supposedly the author of Daniel here sees him dying in the land of Israel, but he actually dies in the eastern part of his empire. It seems that the author of Daniel wrote this prophecy sometime before these events. So the author is accurate up to about 166 or early 165, but after that he's not accurate. Therefore, he must live in 166 or early 165. When he goes inaccurate, this is when he actually tries to predict the future. And so I just want you to see this. This is how most scholars are handling the book of Daniel. If he gets it right, it's in the past. If he gets it wrong, it's because it's in the future, and therefore we can know when the author wrote. You just apply this suspicion of any of the author's attempts to actually predict the future. Now, you may ask, what about Christian scholars, those who are more traditional? Well, these days, I don't know that they do very well. And I'm going to give you two examples of evangelical scholars who try to soften the blow here. And I don't think they do very well. Look at Goldingay. These predictions, then, are not to be read as if they were mere anticipatory announcements of fixed future events. Like the promises and warnings of the prophets, they paint an imaginative scenario of the kind of issue that must come from present events. The fact that their portrayal does not correspond to the actual events of the 160s BC compares with the fact that the Christ event does not correspond to other Old Testament prophecies of future redemption. So he points out Isaiah 9, where a light appears in Zebulun. Of course, Matthew quotes this when Jesus shows up in Galilee, the territory of Zebulun, and begins his ministry. It is not the nature of biblical prophecy to give a literal account of events before they take place. So what he's going to say is, well, even prophecies we apply to Christ, he doesn't always fulfill them in the most literal sense possible. And so if there's a prediction here that Antiochus dies in the promised land, this is an imaginative scenario. It's not that he actually has to do that. It's just kind of a metaphorical or poetic way of saying he must die. He must come under the judgment of God for things he has done in the promised land. He doesn't actually have to be in the promised land when he dies in order for this passage to be fulfilled. Lucas is another example of a Christian who is going to try to soften the blow here. Would use of that form make these verses a false prediction, as some then claim? The answer to this depends on what one thinks the seer is trying to do. If he is attempting a detailed prediction of the end of Antiochus' career, then he did get it wrong. However, the use of biblical phrases in the pattern he has constructed in the course of the historical survey suggests that he is doing no more than expressing in general terms the belief that, like other rulers before him who have been given to arrogance, Antiochus will meet an untimely end. Because of Antiochus's greater hubris, his end is expressed in somewhat hyperbolic terms. This would then be not so much a prediction as a promise to the reader that Antiochus will meet an end befitting his blasphemous arrogance and his acts against God and against those who are faithful to God. Again, don't take the prophecy too literally. It's just there to tell you this dude is arrogant and God is going to put him in his place. The fact that he doesn't actually die in the promised land the way the author seems to suggest, this is not a big deal. This is the best that many of these evangelical scholars can do, and I don't think it's good enough, so we need to go another route. At this point, we want to return to discussing the traditional Christian option for this passage, that it's not about Antiochus, but rather it's about the Antichrist. Now, Longman is one of the few modern scholars here who's written a commentary on Daniel and suggests that this is about the Antichrist. Now, he's going to say that Daniel has limited revelation. He may think he is still writing about Antiochus, but he is in fact writing about the Antichrist. Longman says, "It is our understanding of the nature of revelation that the human author did not fully understand the implications of what he was speaking about. In other words, it is conceivable that Daniel thought he was still describing the climactic king of the north, whom he has been speaking about since verse 21 and whom we have identified as Antiochus Epiphanes. But the divine intention may have been much broader." What Tremper Longman is talking about is an idea called sensus plenior. And this idea suggests that while the human writer writes the Bible with his own intentions and with his own knowledge, there may be things that God inspires into his writing that he doesn't even know about. There may be more there than even what the human author intended. Now, if you go to seminary or if you study modern critical study, you'll be told to never think this way, that you're only supposed to try to recover what the human author meant in his original historical context when talking to the original audience. And you know, the historical method is very fruitful. I use it all the time. If you've watched my videos, I do more of that than anything. But to say the Holy Spirit cannot and never does put anything in the Bible beyond what the human author intends to put there is putting the Holy Spirit in a box that we can't justify. And consider the passage that Tremper Longman used to suggest that Daniel may not have all the information. There may be more there than what Daniel knew. He might have been thinking he was just talking about Antiochus when in fact he was talking about the Antichrist. 1 Peter chapter 1. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the suffering of Christ in subsequent glories. It was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves but you, in the things which have now been announced to you by those who preach the good news to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things into which the angels long to look. Now, this is an interesting passage because there are things the angels long to look into, suggesting that they don't know them. And there are things that the prophets were wanting to know more about. They prophesied things and they wanted to understand their own prophecies, but they're told, no, it's not for you. It's for a people yet to come, who Peter here identifies as being the Christian church. And so this is just one place where we can see the prophets did not have a full revelation as to what their own prophecies meant. And so as Christians, as people who believe in passages like 1 Peter, we can't just say that the intentions of the biblical writer are all there is. The Holy Spirit may put more there than what the human authors know. Now, Jerome believed the historical interpretation dropped off right at verse 21. In other words, that we've been talking about the Seleucid and Ptolemies, and then we got to verse 21 and we started talking about the Antichrist. Now, I think he finds the Antichrist too early. I don't think he shows up until later, about verse 36. Nevertheless, in church history, people have read this way, that there was a certain point that the author stopped talking about the Seleucids and Ptolemies and started to talk about the end, started to talk about the Antichrist. We're not making this up out of thin air, in other words. There's a strong precedent for this reading way back since Jerome, and it's been around since Jerome. Many, many people have read this that way. Also, intrusive prophecy is recognized elsewhere in the Bible. And by intrusive prophecy, I mean we're talking about something in the ancient world, and then suddenly in the very next verse, without warning, we're talking about something way later. A good example of this, Luke, Jesus is quoting a passage from Isaiah. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Well, what did the Isaiah passage say? It said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God." Now, many have understood that the reason Jesus did not finish the quote from Isaiah is because he understands that in his first coming, the Spirit of the Lord is upon the Messiah. It is the year of the Lord's favor. However, we're not yet to the day of vengeance. That gets delayed. Right? That is future. So Jesus cuts the verse right in half. There's the part that is already fulfilled, and then the part that is fulfilled much later. Now, even though it's a little bit longer quote, this is a really good example of how New Testament writers would read the Old Testament, and they would say, look, if this was not fulfilled in the ancient context, it has been deferred until the future. Look at what the apostles do here. For David says concerning him, "I saw the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption. You have made known to me the paths of life." Brothers, I may say to you with confidence about the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. In other words, this is a psalm of David, and the psalm says God's not going to let his Holy One see corruption, and he's going to allow him to see the paths of life. Well, now the apostles are reasoning. They're like, well, this didn't happen to David. He died. His body did see corruption. He's still in the tomb. Verse 30, we continue. "Being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that he would not see that he would set one of his descendants on his throne, he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of the Christ, that he was not abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption." In other words, even though this is a psalm of David, and there's a lot in the context that fits David, there are things that David did not fulfill. He did see corruption, and he was not immediately resurrected. And so that part of the psalm must be deferred to the person of the Messiah. What in a prophecy is not fulfilled is necessarily deferred to the future. What about the New Testament? Is there evidence in the New Testament that this passage in Daniel 11 should be applied to the Antichrist? Well, in fact, the only place where Paul describes the Antichrist at any length draws on language here in Daniel. He says, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come," that is, the day that Jesus comes, "unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God." Now that part where he exalts himself over every so-called God, that is being drawn right out of Daniel 11:35. New Testament scholars will agree with this. So we're not just being willy-nilly. We're not just making it up in church history. No, this goes back to the New Testament itself. The New Testament applies this to the man of sin. Now, even earlier portions in this chapter that were fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes get a fuller fulfillment in the future. Matthew 24, which is a combination of Jesus predicting the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the second coming, he says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." So the abomination of desolation is not a one-time fulfillment. It has additional fulfillments. Now, if you are a little bit wary of my assertion that a prophecy can be fulfilled more than one time, you need to look at my presentations on the book of Revelation, especially chapter 1, where I show the New Testament writers, when they read the Old Testament, they understand that a prophecy can be fulfilled multiple times. Same thing with Antiochus in chapter 7 and 8, and in this passage, this great blasphemy, this speaking against God, this is incorporated in the book of Revelation when it talks about the beast. And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. These phrases have been used, this business about making war on the saints and conquering them. You find that type of language in Daniel 7 and in Daniel 8. It is not true that the text only disconnects with Antiochus when the author attempts prediction. Now, that is what people say. They say that in verses 1 through 35, the author records correct history. Verses 36 through 39, we see a picture of Antiochus's strange religious profile. Then the author lives in between verses 39 and 40. And in verse 40, he attempts to actually predict the future and fails. Earlier in this presentation, I tried to show this was not the case. In verses 1 through 35, he records correct history. Then you have your prophetic change of perspective. Verses 36 through 39 do not accurately describe Antiochus's religious profile. It said that whoever is being discussed in those verses does not honor the gods. Well, we've seen from Polybius and other sources that Antiochus honors the gods more than any of his predecessors. Therefore, at verses 36 through 39, the Antichrist's strange religious profile presents itself. And then finally, verses 40 through 45 were not failed predictions about Antiochus. They are predictions about the Antichrist. Now notice here the difference. The bias that says the author cannot possibly have supernatural knowledge of the future. That is the reason why they want 36 through 39 to match Antiochus, and then they say, well, right when he's going to predict the future, that's when he fails. That's when he lives. No, that's not the case. After verse 35, there was no longer a connection with Antiochus Epiphanes. The religious profile didn't fit either. So it's not the case that we just disconnect from Antiochus when it comes time to predict the future and the author cannot successfully do so. The change in prophetic perspective was much earlier in the chapter than what scholars have been willing to admit. So I want to put my reasons for saying this is the Antichrist all together in one place in case some of this seems muddled or confusing, or in case you're trying to put together your own lesson on Daniel. First of all, intrusive prophecy is acknowledged in the New Testament and throughout church history. Sometimes a verse is discussing something at one point in history, and without warning, the very next verse will be a much later era. The New Testament writers draw on this and other prophecies in Daniel because they understand them as not fulfilled or not fully fulfilled. A lot of the things in this chapter that Antiochus did do, the New Testament writers will apply to a future period. And Paul specifically takes this passage at the end of Daniel 11 and says that it is about the future man of sin. Even if Daniel was consciously thinking of Antiochus or his heir, the Old Testament prophets had limited access to truth. Maybe Daniel thought he was talking about Antiochus, but he was in fact talking about the Antichrist, that whole idea of sensus plenior. Nevertheless, I personally think as far back as verse 36, the author knew he was not talking about Antiochus. But either way, either option could work for the Antichrist perspective. Verses 36 through 45 use cosmic themes that do not show up in the rest of the chapter. This notion that somebody just sat down and they tried to predict the future the best they could based on the historical patterns recorded earlier in the chapter, that doesn't work because we have new cosmic themes, all the nations, speaking and having kind of a cosmic war with God, etc. No. That kind of shows us there's a shift in prophetic perspective. We are now talking about the end in this part of the chapter. Skeptics overlook the disjuncture of verses 36 through 39 because they have decided a priori that the author's moment of failure is predictive prophecy. We just talked about this. They think the author lives in between verses 39 and verse 40, but in fact, he stopped talking about Antiochus after verse 35. The sudden mention of Ammon, Moab, Edom, Libya, and Ethiopia cannot be accounted for by the rest of the book or prophetic apocalyptic. So if the author is just trying to guess the future based on patterns of history elsewhere in this book, well, that's hard to account for when he mentions all these countries that never show up elsewhere in Daniel. Also, if he's just borrowing from other passages like Ezekiel, some passages in Isaiah, Zechariah, which talk about the end, well, they don't mention these countries. At least they don't mention most of these countries. And so the scholarly paradigm here, that he's just guessing based on earlier passages in Daniel, based on other prophets, it just doesn't work. No mention of the Roman problem for the king of the north, which is mentioned emphatically earlier. Antiochus III tries to conquer Egypt in verse 19. The Romans stop him. Antiochus IV tries to conquer Egypt. Verses 29 and 30, the Romans stop him. Well, suddenly you get into later verses, and the king of the north conquers Egypt, and the Romans don't stop him. Well, why is that? Well, it makes sense if, in fact, the prophetic perspective has shifted to a period, a future period, when the Roman Empire is not around to stop the king of the north anymore. But if we are, in fact, just talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, the author of this book would know, hey, I need to account for the Romans. I've been talking about, I need to account for them again. Well, he doesn't account for them, and that's because he's no longer talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. It is unlikely that a deceptive or deluded writer would predict his own countrymen's annihilation and the sparing of his enemies. And Antiochus's conquest of Egypt, as all these points are neither desirable nor likely, the author would not want his own countrymen annihilated, he wouldn't want his enemies spared, and he wouldn't want Egypt conquered by the king of the north. So you would at least expect him to write down things that are desirable. But even if he doesn't do that, if he's trying to go down in history as somebody who got it right, as someone who predicted the future correctly, he would write things that are likely, things that might statistically happen. And none of these things are statistically likely at his point in time in the Maccabean revolt. Therefore, we conclude that this prophecy is about the Antichrist. Antiochus and Antichrist share the identity of the king of the north, along with many other kings in this passage, because the Antichrist will embody the arrogance and the blasphemy of history's political rulers. I hope this was helpful to you, and I hope you'll join me next time in Daniel 12 as we look at the most extensive Old Testament passage on the resurrection of the dead.